Greetings. We're doing a series of Bible studies on the Gospel readings for the following Sunday. For those many people who are parts of churches that use the Revised Common Lectionary, a standard set of readings that take you through most of the New Testament every 3 years for the Gospel reading at a communion service. And this talk is going live on YouTube on the last Monday of May 2024, and it relates to the readings for Sunday the 2nd of June, which is the first Sunday after Trinity. That out of the way, we're actually looking at Mark chapter 2, verse 23 to chapter 3, verse 6. Don't worry about the chapter break. Chapters and verses were invented a long time after the Gospels were written. If I was redoing them, the chapter would end at chapter 3, verse 6, and begin at chapter 2, verse 1. Because that you've got there from chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 6, a series of 5 events, miracles, activities, sayings, things that Jesus does, which all begin to provoke opposition against him. And the opposition grows as Jesus is actually demonstrating his authority. So you've got 5 events in Mark chapter 2 and the first 6 verses of chapter 3 that I think Mark has put together, though I think chronologically they probably belong together in that order as well. But they very clearly show a development both of Jesus' declarations of his own authority in word and in action, and the leadership, the Jewish leadership of the time, and not just Jewish, resisting his authority and getting more and more angry with him for asserting it. And there are a number of trigger points. One of the great triggers is the word Sabbath. One of the commentaries on Mark's Gospel says there's a very important formula to remember, little mathematical formula. Jesus plus Sabbath equals trouble. Well, yes. Our passage today, Mark 2:23, begins one Sabbath. Something's going to happen. And it ends, chapter 3, verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So Sabbath is a regular trigger for Jesus to do something with which the leadership will find fault, and their questions and criticisms of him and their dislike of what he's doing and saying reaches sort of climax in verse 6 of chapter 3 as they begin to conspire how to destroy him. And notice Pharisees and Herodians. The Pharisees get the first look in their objections in this section of Mark's Gospel, and they're now working with the Herodians, who probably weren't a political party, but they're clearly the followers of Herod, the quasi-king, quisling king, call him what you will, who under the Roman Empire has a degree of authority for how the Jewish folk would behave. And he tends to give in to Rome more often than not, and not stand up for his own people. We've got 2 stories in this passage. Could well be the same day. They're both on the Sabbath, That's a trigger. In the first one, chapter 2, verse 23 onwards, he and his disciples are going through the cornfields, and we're told the disciples, doesn't say Jesus himself, but that doesn't matter. The disciples began to pluck heads of grain. It was allowed in the Old Testament law that if you were walking through a cornfield, you could pick a few heads of grain as you went to eat, little snack. It was expected that farmers who owned fields and would often be quite wealthy would allow people, usually the poor or those who didn't have their resources, to walk through and pick what they could pick by hand as they walked, not sacks full to take away with them. And similarly, once the harvesting had been done, anything that was left, the poor could take. The harvester wasn't to go back and pick up what was left on the ground after the first harvest. That was for the poor, the needy, the hungry. And that's how the system worked. The poor or the hungry couldn't go in and cut the crop and gather large amounts. They couldn't gather more than they could take and eat, but that was allowed. It may be that the criticism here is that they were doing it, taking too much, though it doesn't say that. The criticism that's raised is that it's not lawful on the Sabbath. What is or isn't lawful on the Sabbath? Work is what the commandments say, and that needs a bit of defining as to what is work and what is not work. And that's always been a difficult definition. But many of the Jewish writers, after the Ten Commandments, started defining it in incredibly legalistic ways as to exactly how far you could walk or exactly how much you could do. And some of their definitions were crazy. If someone broke a limb, it could only be set on the Sabbath if it was immediate life-threatening situation. Otherwise, resetting it would have to wait till the next day. One of the Jewish writers, who was very popular and hugely influential, said if a roof of a building caved in on the Sabbath, you could do a little search and rescue operation, and anyone who was alive under the building but whose life was threatened, you could get them out on the Sabbath. If they're already dead, you couldn't. But you could do something, you could work if it saved a life. But if it wasn't going to save a life, if they just had a minor an injury that could be repaired the next day or would get better on its own, then you ignore it on the Sabbath. So if someone's cut themselves, you ignore it. If they're bleeding to death, you stop the bleeding. Now that is an incredibly legalistic, silly in my book way of defining things, but it's how some of the Jewish rabbis and writers operated. And it's the same sort of spirit that's going on here, that's saying you on a normal day you could go through the field and if you're hungry take a few bits of food from the field and eat them, but on a Sabbath you couldn't, because that counted as work. That's an odd one to me, but it was very legalistic. And they criticized Jesus, the Pharisees, because his followers, his disciples, are doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath. Jesus' answer is very clever as always, but he's shifting the ground in a big way. He doesn't talk initially about the Sabbath. Instead, he is initially bringing in something about authority, both human need, if people are hungry, and authority. Because what he says is, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? It's not referencing the Sabbath at all. He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. David at this point is an outlaw. Saul and his army are chasing him. David and his companions have to find food where they can and find safety where they can. And they eat the priest's bread, 12 loaves put on the altar each week for the priests to eat. And David took it. David, of course, was the great king, or he became the great king. He was the hero. And although he's 1,000 years before Jesus, if David did it, it was okay. David's psalms were used in worship. David was used as an example of the great king who, apart from whatever else he did, he conquered Jerusalem and made Jerusalem instead of Hebron his capital. And that was the heart of who Israel felt they were. They were David's nation, and David was their great king. And they believed that David's descendant, as promised in the Old Testament, would come and be their Messiah, their king forever. So what David did, generally speaking, he didn't criticize. Of course, there were a couple of examples of sinful, bad behavior from David, and they were there as a warning. But basically, David was seen as not just a good king, but one sent by God and the predecessor, the ancestor of the Messiah they were looking forward to. So if David did it, it was okay. And what David did wasn't preaching the Sabbath, it was taking what was holy and making use of it for ordinary purposes. Holy, set apart just for the priests. And David says, I and my men are hungry, we're having it. And human need overrides the holiness, the set apartness of the bread, but also David, in his authority, sets aside the holiness of the bread and uses it and eats it. And Jesus is beginning, this is the first occasion, but a few more times he's going to compare himself with David and acknowledge the title Son of David, which begins to be given to him. He's the king. He's come among his people as king, and to some extent is able not to rewrite the rules. Well, maybe yes, to rewrite the rules, certainly to reinterpret the rules. And that's what he's doing here. He's saying, in effect, David had authority to reinterpret the rules. So bread set aside as holy could be used if the king and his men were hungry. That's a legitimate use of holy set aside bread. David has redefined the rules, not in the way that the normal Jewish writers would redefine the rules, stricter and stricter and stricter, but David is redefining the rules in what you might call a pragmatic, common sense way. And Jesus goes on to say, as a punchline of this first story, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now that second bit, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, we'll deal with in a minute. First, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. Laws, and the Sabbath is a big law. It's in a number of words, it's the longest of the Ten Commandments. Laws weren't made to repress us, but to bless us. That's what God's Ten Commandments are about. How to live a life of blessedness. Follow the Ten Commandments. It's not about repression. It's about living well. And certainly a day set apart is an important part of living well and doing what you need to do and doing your work and earning your money and doing your farming and fulfilling your various duties in society and to one another and so on. Do that in 6 days, have one day where you're free of that and free to focus on worshipping God, but also free. But that day is not a rigid rule to tie you down. It is a day, it is important. Jesus does not abolish the Sabbath, and Christians would do well and churches would do well to work out how that works today and what use we want to make of one day in 7 as set apart, but not with rigid rules that have been written perhaps by strict lawyers who almost don't have to worry about where the food is coming from. David reinterpreted the law of the sacredness of the bread, and Jesus says, I'm reinterpreting the law of the Sabbath. And it's okay. If you're hungry and it's legal to take food from a field and eat it, which it is, then carry on. In our society, pinching someone's crops that they're growing isn't legal. Rules will vary from place to place. But Jesus sets himself up as the Son of David with authority. And so the final verse 28 of chapter 2, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The word order in the Greek is quite odd. He's saying, Lord, the Son of Man is even of the Sabbath. It's the sort of language that Yoda in Star Wars might use when words get moved around for humor or for effect. But here it's for emphasis. Lord, the Son of Man is even of the Sabbath. There's no messing here. I'm in charge. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't my master. The commandments aren't our master. For the believer, for the Christian, the commandments are God's gift to help us to live well. But they're not our master. Jesus is master and Lord. And so we move to the second of these two stories, very possibly the same day. Again, he entered the synagogue, chapter 3, and a man was there who had a withered hand. Now, there's interesting speculation here. Was this just a coincidence, or was this something that the Pharisees or others had set up? That they brought the man there particularly to see, because it says they watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath. It may well be a setup, a trap for Jesus. The Pharisees are there to watch so that they might accuse him. Any number of things going on here in the psychology of the situation. Jesus says to the man, come forward. He doesn't always, usually, embarrass people who are injured or hurt or sick or troubled. Often they come to him or their friends bring them, but here he is singling him out. There he is in the congregation, a man with a withered hand, could mean a variety of things, but clearly his hand is impaired. quite seriously. Come forward. He brings him out. He's up for the challenge. And he says to them, is it lawful to do good or do harm on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill? Now, that is a strange question, and they are silenced by it, utterly silenced. Of course, it isn't lawful to do harm on the Sabbath, but is it lawful to do good? Well, they would say only within certain parameters. You can attempt to, if the roof's fallen in, you can see if anyone's life can be saved, but if their life can't be saved, you don't do anything. If their life can be saved, that's the exception, or the bit of work that's allowed. But there is some good that they wouldn't allow in their rules, such as resetting a broken bone on the Sabbath. If it wasn't life-threatening, it could be done the next day. I think we would understand medically now that actually for good healing, resetting quickly is better than leaving it a day or two, but it isn't the end of the world if it's left a day or two. But that wasn't the challenge. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm? Of course, the answer is not lawful to do harm. It is lawful to do good, but only if it would save a life, and fixing a withered arm wouldn't save a life at all. But then he says, is it lawful to save life or to kill? That's nothing to do with a withered arm, is it? Of course, in their rules, saving a life was possible, but killing, certainly not, or doing harm. Where's the doing harm come from? Where's the killing? Why is he asking that? Well, the effect of asking that is that it silences them. And he then looks around at them with anger, at the Pharisees. He's grieved at their hardness of heart. Jesus' emotion is strong here, isn't it? He is angry with them, and he's deeply distressed, would translate it accurately, at their stubbornness. They will not listen. They will not change their rigid views. They will not learn from him and be taught. Because what is it they're doing? Well, they've come there in order to accuse him. And you see at the end of the passage, what they want is an excuse, a reason to destroy him. They want to find him guilty of major sin. Blasphemy would do nicely, claiming he's God. Claiming to rewrite the commandments would do nicely as a sort of blasphemy. They want to destroy him. In other words, they on the Sabbath are plotting to kill. And he's asking them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or harm? To save life or to kill? Now he's planning to do good. They are planning to kill. And his question silences them. Lawful to do good or do harm? Well, it's certainly doing more good than harm if you heal someone's arm. Is it lawful to save life or to kill? Well, plotting to kill certainly isn't lawful. He's challenging them, not for anything they've said, but challenging them because of what's in their hearts, which he sees and knows. And this is why he's angry. And they're silent. They've nothing to say. They can't answer this one. It's one of the hardest questions Jesus ever asks the Pharisees, because he's rumbled them. He knows what they're up to. He looks around at them with anger. That looking around is an interesting word too. It's quite a strong word. He looks around on one or two other occasions in this gospel, and doubtless we'll find some of them on other occasions. But with anger and with grief or deep distress at their hardness of heart. He doesn't want them to be like this, but he's angry that they are, that they're just plotting to kill him, and they're happy to use this man to trick him. They don't care about the poor man with his withered arm. So he says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretches it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees go out and immediately conspire with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. That's the second story, or the fifth of 5 in this sequence from chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 6. It'd be interesting to read them all if you've got a little bit of, it won't take very long, and do a little study and think of the 5 occasions, 5 events, possibly quite a short period of time. It's almost certainly all in Capernaum. And within a short passage of time, 5 times he does or says something that in some way demonstrates his authority or claims his authority, and the opposition against him mounts as he does so. And that's certainly the theme of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3 of Mark. Just look again at Jesus. He wants to do good. He wants to heal the man, even though that in some ways isn't the main point of the story. The main point of the story is that the Pharisees are trying to trap him. And in one sense, he's willing to walk into their trap, because the trap is, you state your authority again? Yes, I will. I'll show you my authority, is what he's saying. He's not frightened of walking into that trap, of restating his authority, but he's angry. He's brave. He's compassionate in the way he heals the man, but he's angry at them, the Pharisees, for using a man with a disability in that way. He's angry at them because they're refusing his authority and already thinking how to destroy him, and they're about to start the actual plot. He's grieved, he's deeply distressed at their utter stubbornness, that they will not accept the Son of David, the Messiah, the long-promised, long-awaited one who's come among them, because they've written their own rules and they've defined their own religion in a way that doesn't leave room for the Son of David, the Saviour, who will reinterpret the law so that it frees instead of traps. He'll reinterpret the law so that it allows joy and fullness of life and wholeness. There's a lot here to think about and to pray about. Don't rewrite your religion or your rules in a way that leaves Jesus out. Allow yourself to be surprised by his authority and by his compassion. Amen.